Okay, I think that we will get started now, and if anyone else trickles in, I'll be able to allow them in. So, welcome everyone to the Margaret Angus Research Fellowship presentation for the year of 2020. I'm just going to introduce myself. So I am not the fellow. My name is Kevin Morehouse. I'm the museum manager and the program director for the Museum of Healthcare. I am also technically the acting curator of the Museum of Healthcare right now. So it is my pleasure to do some of the introductions for this sort of presentation this evening. I thank you all for joining us. I hope everyone was able to connect. I saw the chat going off. Seems like I can be seen and heard well, and I think we'll do a quick check with Jessica when she joins on in just a second. Just a quick few housekeeping things before we get started. We have built this discussion for a presentation time as well as a question time. So you may notice that both your video and audio are muted and off. That's by design. We've got about a 40-minute presentation for you today. And then afterwards, we're going to have some time at the end to ask some questions. So please save your questions until the end, and we'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask questions either with the chat or with video live, whatever you would like to pick in that regard. Just as another housekeeping thing, this meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want your question to be recorded or anything like that, shoot us a quick email or a message after the presentation. I'll be happy to cut that out. That's not an issue for me. But the benefit of it being recorded is that this presentation will be posted a little bit later on this week on our YouTube page, and you'll see a link for that in just a second when I post that. And I will be in the chat during the presentation. If you have any questions or you're having any difficulties, I'll be happy to try and answer those, okay? I'm just going to, if you check the chat, I'm just going to send some links over really quickly just before we get started. If you like what you see here today, there's a couple of other things you can check out as part of the Museum of Healthcare sort of digital online stuff. So we have the museumofhealthcare.ca, that's our website. That's where you'll find a posting of this full manuscript from this presentation, as well as things like online exhibits, event postings, and stuff like that. Our online catalog, that's that andernaut.com one there, more than 15,000 objects are posted on there, detailed catalog records of all of the objects that are in the museum, free of charge, really detailed. So if you hear anything in this presentation or you'd like to research something more, that's what that's there for. And museumofhealthcare.blog, that's our blog site. We have 100+ articles on there so far, at-home activities, education aspects, all that kind of stuff, as well as articles like the one that was written for this fellowship presentation in previous years and everything like that. So those links are there. You can also just do a quick search on Google and you'll be able to find everything as well too. Okay, so we will get started. So for those of you that are not aware or are first-time attendees to this presentation, the Margaret Angus Research Fellowship is a yearly project run by the Museum of Healthcare at Kingston to highlight one student's research into a particular facet of Canada's health and healthcare history. The Margaret Angus Research Fellowship is named after Dr. Margaret Angus, whose historical publication and contributions to the Kingston community through work at Queen's University, the Agnes Etherington Arts Centre, St. Lawrence College, and Kingston General Hospital, and to the larger Canadian heritage community have been read and recognized many, many years and many years to come. Dr. Angus passed away in February 2008 in her 100th year, but we hope her legacy still lives on, at least partially, through the fascinating history discussed each year during this fellowship. Now in its 24th year, the fellowship consists of a museum program committee members selecting one candidate from a list of applications to become the fellow for the year, usually in April of that year. From May to September, the fellow, through consultation with a wide variety of sources, as well as the museum's artifacts and archival research, creates a series of both blog post articles, as I just mentioned, you can find those on our blog site, as well as working up cumulatively towards a final manuscript, which will also be posted on our website that you can read, completed by the end of September. In October of every year, the fellow holds a public presentation, and which the 2021 you are about to experience. Normally, this presentation is done in person. Obviously, given circumstances, we can't do that, but we think it's going to be great just the same. Before I continue, just a couple of special thanks. One to Dr. Jane Arrington, who I know is here today. Dr. Arrington has been a longtime supporter of the Museum of Healthcare and sort of all of its aspects, but is also acting as the supervisor for this presentation. And I know did a lot of work with Jessica over the past 6 months. To the program committee at the Museum of Healthcare, I know the program committee chair, Dr. Ian Gemmell, is in the audience as well too. They are part of the team that does the preparation, does the selection of the candidates, answers any question, and just provides general support to the program. And to Jessica Lanziner. So she's going to be our presenter today. I just wanted to give her a quick thanks myself, just for sort of bearing with us, making the best of a bad situation, I think would be the case. I think that normally we're always happy to see the fellow in the museum walking around, handling things and asking questions, but I think given the circumstances, we managed to get through it. And I think she managed to produce one heck of a really good presentation and a manuscript for tonight. So about the presenter for tonight. Jessica Lanziner is an alumna of Queen's University, holding a Bachelor of Fine Art and Art History degree with a focus on printmaking and oil painting. She has previously worked on a diverse range of projects in various museums and galleries, including the Agnes Etherington Art Center, the Modern Fuel Artist Run Center, and the Uxbridge Historical Center, and the Venice Minicle. She is currently in her final year of the Master of Museum Studies program at the University of Toronto with a collaborative specialization in book history and print culture. I like to add that Jessica is also the first student who has ever done this fellowship completely remotely. So I think that's a success in and of itself. The abstract for the presentation tonight, I'm almost done, I promise. Studying the history of the infectious disease outbreaks, it becomes evident that society is hesitant to accept new information. Whether it is the production of masks and gloves or quarantines and vaccines, people take time to adjust to updated healthcare standards. From the discovery of germ theory through to the modern era, Jessica Lanziner traces how protective personal equipment and strategies of prevention have evolved to the current standard of practice during the COVID-19 pandemic. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, who's going to pop up on the screen here and get started with the presentation.
Alrighty, so thank you very much, Kevin, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. And as he said, welcome to our first ever virtual Margaret Agnes Research Fellow presentation. I'm very pleased to be sharing my work from the summer with all of you, albeit in this kind of odd virtual environment, though perhaps not too odd for a lot of us who this is now our regular way of interacting. And echoes for the same reasons of which we are online tonight, my development of this research project is actually also largely in debt to the COVID-19 pandemic. So at the time of application calls, I was kind of in the same situation as everyone else is around us right now. I was transitioning to online education in my master's degree, working in a somewhat precarious and dangerous customer service environment, and the pandemic really was and continues to be my life. As many turned to making sourdough, learning to knit, binge watching television series, all of which I definitely took part in, I also took to reading. I read a lot at any time, mostly fiction, historical fiction, and some really well-written mystery novels. This time, I decided to delve into something a little bit different. One of these such books is the one you see on the screen here, titled The Butchering Art by Lindsay Fitzharris. This book is all about the development out of the grisly world of Victorian medicine and its journey into the revised surgical world of antiseptic surgery. She traces through history from Robert Liston to Joseph Lister and onward through numerous surgeons in this book. And it really gave me my first glimpse of the incredibly rich world of surgical history. I highly recommend it if you have not read it. It will have a lot of connections to some of the stuff you see this evening. And so in between learning about the basis of the history of antiseptic surgery and living through this worldwide pandemic, my idea for this project kind of came to life. So through this research, I have traced an overview of a kind of social history of the transition out of miasmic theory and into germ theory, to the evolution of protective equipment and strategies, and into the implementation of these protocols during disease outbreaks in Canada, including COVID-19 currently, and historically other like diseases to the one we're experiencing today, including the 1918 influenza, tuberculosis, and the 2003 SARS epidemic. So with all of the skepticism in the news and the seemingly persistent discussions of fake news, as well as certain political leaders' spread of dangerous misinformation, I decided to go back to the start. I really wanted this to be a cohesive and understandable history of why we currently do what we do with healthcare. Where did we get the idea to wear masks? How do we even know that diseases like COVID-19 are contagious? And why do we have all these standards? Why should we believe them? So to understand this, we're going to travel back several hundred years to the mid-19th century, when the world was beginning to transition into the prevailing beliefs of germ theory. So in the beginning of the 19th century, doctors and surgeons used to wear unwashed aprons in very filthy hospital rooms, and they were mystified with the high infection and mortality rates of their patients. In the 19th century England, it was approximated that 40% of all deaths were caused by infectious diseases. This was before germ theory, and when it was instead believed that diseases were caused by miasma, which is a noxious form of bad air believed to originate from sewage, cemeteries, and general filth. The development of germ theory came out of Europe during the 19th century as a result of the attempts of several medical professionals to provide better care for their patients who were dying at alarming rates for seemingly unknown reasons. Doctors, surgeons, and the public alike were in desperate need to reform their healthcare practices and lower the disastrous numbers of disease outbreaks and high mortality rates. Four medical professionals, in particular, were foundational in their contributions to germ theory and making a basis for the proof behind the transmittance of the diseases I will be discussing at the end of this. These people, from left to right as you see here, are Louis Pasteur, Joseph Lister, Robert Koch, and Carl Fluge. Pasteur, who you may know from the process of pasteurization, which is named after him, concluded through many experiments with heating and cooling different substances that microorganisms were causing diseases to spread and multiply. Joseph Lister applied Pasteur's theories into his field of surgery and started cleaning his surgical instruments with a solution that killed the bacteria. Robert Koch built on that and undertook experiments with growing and observing bacterial cultures. He developed a set of criteria explaining the relationship and proving that diseases are caused by particular organisms. And then my final person of note on the right here is Carl Fluge, who actually was a co-worker of Koch. During experiments with tuberculosis research, he discovered that the disease was being transmitted when people expelled droplets while talking, sneezing, coughing, and breathing. We know this today as the droplet theory of infection, which is also the theory behind explaining how COVID is transmitted. So the work of these four and their counterparts journeyed across the globe. While germ theory, like all new medical discoveries, was met with a great amount of skepticism, it gradually caught on. In Canada, public health was likewise in need of a reform, as Victorian England was, and with similarly high mortality rates plaguing the population as the same kind of issues of infectious diseases. The new ideas of germ theory quickly traveled with the increasing number of immigrants to Canada who were educated in the progressive European healthcare system. The first Public Health Act of Ontario was passed in 1873 and revised again in 1882. In Toronto, Dr. William Caniff was appointed the city's first medical officer of health in 1883. Water supplies and sanitation were improved. Drinking fountains with communal cups were replaced, the more traditional ones we see today, as the ones with shared cups were spreading a lot of germs, and emphasis was placed upon the importance of maintaining hygiene. Medical education was likewise thriving in Canada, with schools popping up across the country. 7 medical schools in total were established in Canada just by the year 1900. And with an increasingly educated population and public health workers advocating for disease reform, Canada began to pivot more money and research into treatment options, including specialized treatment centers, to treat those with infectious diseases. So with that bit of background, we've established a basis. So if any of you are not from a medical background, like I myself am not, as we heard earlier from Kevin, I come from a background in fine art and art history. You now have a bit of a crash course in the history of how we first started thinking about preventing these diseases. The next step is the history of disease prevention itself, which I've divided into 2 subsections that look at the histories of the physical equipments that we use to protect ourselves, known as PPE or personal protective equipments, and strategies. So first off, I like to start with my favorite piece of PPE, the plague doctor outfit, which you see on your screen. The plague ravaged across Europe and Asia from the 14th to 17th centuries, with people believing it was caused by the malignant air or miasma, as we discussed earlier. It killed approximately 50 million people in Europe and an estimated 200 million people worldwide. The plague doctor uniform was designed to protect doctors who were treating plague patients from the bad air that was believed to be killing them. The elaborate costume, first described and pictured here in a 1721 description, gave doctors the sense of safety while treating patients. However, if any of you are familiar with this, you will recall that it was actually completely useless in protecting them against the plague. So while it was supposed to protect against the bad air, which was not the cause of the plague, it was infected flea bites, we need to think about how it possibly could have served some secondary uses. So while the outfit itself was certainly not sterilized or properly cleaned, we can see some resemblances between the plague doctor's mask, the airtight gloves, and the airtight outfit that they are wearing. It somewhat resembles our models of protective equipment today. So the first piece of PPE that is paramount to the prevention of disease is one of the most essential ones for epidemic respiratory diseases. The face mask, the earliest one as I briefly touched upon a few minutes ago, is credited to Carl Fluge and the mask he developed as a result of his research with tuberculosis in the late 19th century. Thanks to Fluge, doctors started to have their tuberculosis patients wear masks made of gauze strips over the mouth to stop infected people from passing on the infection. One of the most influential people to help with the implementation of the mask was Dr. Wu Leente. He was working in Manchuria during the outbreak of the 1911 Manchurian plague, when he made the move towards implementing the face mask as a means of controlling the disease. Dr. Leente quickly deduced that the plague was pneumonic, meaning it spread by droplets, because of how quickly it was spreading through the population. It was really the only theory that made sense. And based upon his theory, he recommended that people wear a mask that covered the mouth and nose. However, he was very, very widely disregarded and discredited by almost all doctors because of his young age and his race, despite being a well-educated and brilliant scientist. Across the affected areas in China, medical officers went on practicing without masks. One of these such doctors, a very highly respected French doctor named Gerald Mesny, was among the skeptics, and he often criticized Wu Leente and humiliated him in a very racist manner. Dr. Mesny, however, went on to continue to attend to the sick in these plague hospitals without wearing a mask or having patients wear the mask that Dr. Leente had suggested. Within a short period of time, Dr. Mesny contracted the disease and died. And with that came an outpour of support for the mask wearing in the community. Over the years, Dr. Liente's face mask gradually became the surgical style mask we know today. It went through several iterations, from the quest for a germ-proof gauze mask, one that ultimately failed, reusable cloth masks, and finally to a disposable synthetic fiber mask, which we use today so that we can be as sterile as possible, throwing it out when we are finished procedures. The other mask we know today is an N95. However, it's actually quite different from the surgical mask, of which are the two images you see on the left here. Instead, this one actually came out of a development from respirators. So stemming out of the respirators that were developed to defend against chemical attacks pioneered during World War I, which is an early example you see on the right side of your screen there, respirators were modified to equip miners against black lung, people with working in mold removal and air filtration purposes. However, these masks at the time were very, very large, cumbersome, and heavy, and there was a lot of motivation to develop a lighter model. This is where the company 3M comes in 1972 and develops the single-use respirator known as the N95. While these respirators come in all kinds of options that denote their resistance to oils, that's what the letter part of it means, the N95 became the chosen mask for protection against respiratory illnesses. It does not protect against oils, but it does protect against the dangerous particles carried in respiratory droplets. It started to be used in this capacity when drug-resistant tuberculosis sprouted up in the 1970s. Up next is gloves, which were a most interesting development in protective equipment. Likewise to the early masks, gloves were initially developed to protect doctors against their patients, and not quite the other way around. In 1758, a German obstetrician attempted to make gloves out of the stomach lining of a sheep to keep his hands from getting messy, but they fell apart inside the patient. Then later, with the adoption of germ theory, surgeons tried to make gloves out of cotton and silk, but they too were not too useful because they quickly were soaked in blood and really were just slippery and an extra piece between their hands and the patient. It was not until 1899 that one surgeon, Dr. William Halsted at Johns Hopkins University, contracted Goodyear, the tire company, to experiment with making rubber gloves. This was because one of his nurses, Carolyn Hampton, who would later become his wife, experienced dermatitis of her hands and arms as a result to the antiseptic solutions that were being used to clean the instruments in the surgery room. Dr. William Halsted realized that Charles Goodyear had actually discovered decades earlier how to make rubber more elastic. So Halsted contacted Goodyear to experiment with making a new model of these rubber gloves. With some resistance and also some modifications, the protective gloves got more and more popular. When they first started out, they were incredibly thick and somewhat closer to the gloves that you have to wear for very intense use of fireproof kind of materials, that kind of thickness. And it wasn't exactly the most comfortable thing. So as people experimented with it and doctors came up with thinner and thinner rubbers, they did eventually catch on. There were some later modifications made as well when people began experiencing allergic reactions to some of the latex models. So now these gloves are more often comprised of a synthetic rubber material that does not cause these reactions. And the final piece of protective equipment here is attire. So prior to the 19th century, surgeons and medical providers dressed for their procedures in street clothes and a black frock, which was notably caked in blood and pus from previous operations. More surprisingly, this dried blood and pus on their uniforms was actually thought to be very representative of the surgeon's experience and thus denote greater abilities as medical professionals. So basically, the more blood and pus was on their frocks, the better they were seen as doctors. The primary purpose of such surgical attire was just like the early versions of masks and gloves, worn to protect the wearer against the patient. When Dr. Joseph Lister conducted surgery during the last years of his practice, he would roll up his sleeves and pin an unsterilized towel to his waistcoat just for a bit of protection. However, as Lister's germ theory and antisepsis practices gained acceptance and evolved a little bit, surgeons and doctors began to look at reforming their clothing to fall more in line with the new sterilization and sanitation standards. German surgeon Gustav Neuber is credited with being the first to use a sterilized surgical gown in the late 19th century, also concluding that surgical site infections were decreased when the surgeons wore both a cap and gown as well. This sterilized gown was white in color, with white garments becoming synonymous with cleanliness and purity, two practices which were heavily influenced by the emphasis in growing cities on personal hygiene and sanitation. The material of the gowns has changed with the disposable system, but the design, which covers the body and arms, at the back, and ties, is really largely the same. The one primary change from this time to today in much of our surgical wear is the color. While white was an upgrade from the dark blood-soaked frocks, it has caused a lot of strain on the eyes of healthcare professionals because of the reflection of bright lights on white linens. The most popular colors then became spinach green because it complements the color of hemoglobin, as well as sky blue because it was a favorite color when television was first being used with color in the 1950s for closed circuit teaching in hospitals. Protective attire in the modern day also takes multiple more precautions, with disposable gowns worn over scrubs and procedures that have high risk of infections and additional layers as needed. So besides the physical equipment that we have developed over the years to help protect against germs and especially infectious diseases, we have also developed some strategies. And they work well in combination with the use of protective equipment, but more times than not, they're often placed in heavier emphasis because of the failure of PPE to actually contain a particular disease. The first one I want to highlight here is hand washing, which has turned out, actually my journey with researching it was a little different than I thought it would be, has a lot of connections to do with religion as well as some racist campaign history. Hand washing had been a practice in a number of cultures for religious and cultural reasons, yet the relationship between hand washing and disease was only understood about 200 years ago. During the 14th century plague, the ritual hand washing by Jewish populations likely had an effect on their survival, as they had a significantly lower mortality rate than that of their proximate populations. It was not until the mid-19th century that one Hungarian doctor working in Vienna, named Ignaz Semmelweis, established that hospital-acquired diseases were spread by the hands of healthcare workers. Semmelweis established that hospital-acquired diseases were being spread by the hands of healthcare workers. Semmelweis noted that doctors and medical students were often traveling between the autopsy rooms and delivery theaters, and that their hands carried noticeable odors despite having been washed in water. While people were skeptical of Semmelweis's ideas for many years, it too gradually caught on among the medical community. Joseph Lister, for example, expanded upon his personal practice of antiseptic surgery. In 1867, Lister required his team to wash with a carbolic acid solution to help kill the germs. Hand washing continued to gain popularity, and by the mid-19th century, boards of sanitation and public health began to establish and promote a more healthy living situation, especially in overcrowded cities. By the early 20th century, advertisements for hand washing soaps targeted people in these overcrowded communities and used words like purity, health, and virtues of cleanliness to align hand washing with godliness. Other advertisements thoughtfully paired cleanliness and crime prevention by using analogies that discuss the ability of soap to clean up the so-called filthy corners of the earth. However, this quickly developed into a lot of ads with racial messages like the one seen on the right of your screen here, which tried to associate cleanliness with being European and overall very white. While underlying racial messages continue to be present in soap and cleaning product advertisements, if anyone's curious, I can send you some great information on Ivory soap. Hand washing nonetheless did play a very important role in assisting the prevention of the spread of the disease. Hand washing became a regular practice throughout the 20th century for both the public and medical communities. In the 1960s in the United States, it was recommended that healthcare workers should wash their hands for 1 to 2 minutes before and after patient care. By the 1970s and 1980s, Canada and the United States, as well as some countries outside of North America, established rigorous standards for hand washing procedures in hospitals. The most intense version of this can be seen in the surgical ward, where the sterile team members perform a technical surgical scrub of their hands and arms, as well as proper drying, and then don their protective equipment in order to minimize any possible risk of infections in surgery. The second, and very incredibly important strategy that we've developed to manage disease is the practice of quarantining. One of the first times it was used in Europe was in the 14th century when the plague epidemic arrived on ships in Sicily from the Eastern Mediterranean and brought with them infected flea bites on sailors, rats, and cargo. The disease decimated populations and killed approximately 20 million people worldwide through the 14th century, as I mentioned earlier, the plague. In Italy, Venice was a major trade port at this time and was especially wary of the incoming ships believed to be harboring this disease. If a ship were suspected of bearing the believed miasmic illness, it would have to wait 40 days before any passengers or good could come ashore. Now, for any of you that know Italian, this 40-day waiting period was known as quarantinario, which is also the root word where we get quarantine from. This quarantine method spread throughout Europe, and over the next several hundred years, quarantines and related concepts of cohorting and isolation became regular practice to control the outbreak of certain diseases around the world. The way in which quarantine methods are enforced, however, has changed a great deal. While hospitals and quarantine centers were used to isolate large outbreaks in one location, like the plague centers in Europe and tuberculosis hospitals in Canada, other people have often been forced to quarantine within their own homes. The outbreaks of several infectious diseases in the 19th and 20th centuries, including cholera, measles, scarlet fever, smallpox, whooping cough, polio, and typhoid fever, would require people to stay within their homes, and the boards of health would actually place notices on their door, which would warn visitors of the presence of the disease. The signs were a desperate measure to implement any kind of protection of citizens from this disease. And in an era before social media, texting, and mass news reporting, this method allowed visitors to be warned against entering the homes of those who were ill. However, door postings like these phased out of practice in the mid-20th century, which is in part due to privacy concerns that things like public signage can bring on. They were problematic socially and ethically because they outed people in communities for their illnesses. In the modern day, citizens are expected to follow the local quarantine rules, which are laid out by varying governing bodies. In Canada, the Quarantine Act was brought into law in 2005 following the SARS outbreak in Toronto, something which we will actually look closer at in a few minutes. An update to the quarantine regulations from the late 19th century, this act gives the Government of Canada the power to implement measures to try and prevent the spread of communicable diseases and introduce them to new neighborhoods. The modern day use of quarantine techniques in this act, as I'm sure we are all too aware, also includes placing restrictions upon large gatherings and public distancing measures. And the final and very important development in the area of disease prevention is among the vaccination and medication category. Using PPE, encouraging proper hygiene, and imposing quarantines is not always enough to prevent the spread of a particular disease, once again, as we all know too well. The development of antibiotics and other medications also became integral to managing diseases and allowed people to survive the illnesses even if they do not have vaccines for them. The advancements of virology and germ theory by scientists in the 19th century paved the way for the development of medical interventions to assist in managing diseases. A little crash course in vaccines for all of us not from the science background. Vaccines basically work by introducing a weakened version of the disease into the body and then teaching the body to respond to that as if it were the real germ. So by doing this, the immune system remembers this germ and knows how to destroy it the next time it sees it, when it's presumably the real germ, and before it has a chance to make the person sick. In 1796, English scientist Edward Jenner developed the first vaccine, this one for smallpox. He used cowpox, which is an uncommon viral disease that's located on cows' udders, and he used it to develop the smallpox vaccine because humans could actually contract the disease on their hands when they were milking the cows. So when it transferred to humans, it actually very similarly resembled a mild version of smallpox. So through several years of experiments and observations, Jenner observed that there were 15 people who had cowpox on their hands that when later subjected to smallpox didn't contract the disease. Every other person in that study who had not been introduced to cowpox did contract the disease. He theorized that the pus from blisters on the cow's udders that were transferred onto the hands of milkmaids protected them against the cowpox disease. And from that, he developed his first vaccine, the one for smallpox, sending it around to his medical acquaintances. By the year 1800, Jenner's vaccine had reached most European countries, though not without a lot of skepticism, resistance, and definitely a few issues. Over the next 200 years, however, the vaccine was modified, developed, and researched to become safer and more efficient, with an approved vaccination first coming to Canada in 1953. By May 8th, 1980, the WHO declared the disease had been officially eradicated. So this general concept and strategy of Jenner was and continues to be tested and improved. It's the basic kind of understanding of how all of our vaccines are working. So over the 20th century, vaccines began to be developed for numerous debilitating and deadly diseases. Additional infectious disease vaccines were introduced for yellow fever in 1937, polio in 1955, measles in 1963, mumps in 1967, and rubella in 1969, the last three of which we all know now as a combined MMR vaccine. Under some conditions, however, these vaccines are now actually even mandatory. In schools and in other countries, there's actually stricter regulations. But for as long as these vaccines have existed, people have opposed their use. The anti-vaxxer movement, as we call it today, emerged during Edward Jenner's time. Some claimed that the vaccination acts were invasions of personal liberty, while others actually had religiously founded oppositions to vaccinations, including the MMR vaccine, because it was derived from the cells of aborted fetal tissue. Vaccination nonetheless gained widespread acceptance in higher income countries in the 1950s and 60s as vaccines were developed for the crippling disease of polio. While opposition to vaccination still existed, parents widely accepted the beliefs of vaccines that were preventing disease outbreak, illnesses, and deaths, and polio, which was incredibly debilitating. Most recently, the anti-vaccination movement was re-energized by a former British doctor known as Andrew Wakefield, who decided that the MMR vaccine caused autism in young children. Even though studies have thoroughly debunked any link between this vaccine and autism, vaccination rates have dropped throughout the world since Wakefield's time, with measles outbreaks being higher than they have been in many, many years. So now that you are digesting all of that protective equipment and strategies information, I want you all to think about how we are using the strategies and protective equipments in our current pandemic, and also reflect upon how we have used them in the past. In my ongoing quest to understand and explain why we are doing what we are doing during COVID-19, I looked further after understanding each of these protective equipments and strategies, and into how we as Canadians have managed other similar diseases in the past. Specifically, I broke it down into Canada's management of 4 diseases, which bear similar resemblances to the one we're experiencing today. These are tuberculosis, the 1918 influenza, SARS, and then COVID-19. So tuberculosis is actually a really interesting disease to examine here because it actually has been around for an incredibly long period of time, almost as long as people have. The disease came to Canada for the first time, however, when Europeans arrived on this land in North America in the 17th century, and it actually remains quite prevalent in a lot of communities in the country today. By Confederation, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the country, and you'll recall from earlier that this was the disease that prompted the creation of the first face mask. Canada has historically employed quarantine methods in an effort to control the spread of tuberculosis and provide treatment for all those afflicted. Canada developed institutions called sanatoriums, which were plentiful across the country. In 1953, there were 101 sanatoriums and over 19,000 beds in the country for tuberculosis patients alone. The most popular treatment that was implemented in the first half of the 20th century at these institutions focused on fresh air. Infected peoples were isolated in specialized hospitals and were provided with rest, nutritious food, fresh air, education, and rehabilitation. Other popular methods to control the disease included mask wearing and treatment with a variety of medications. The surgical style of mask was used for a long time to mediate the spread of TB with infected patients until the combinations of the medications were kind of problematic and created a mutated version of the disease, which appeared in the 1970s. When this incredibly infectious strain came on the scene, known as drug-resistant tuberculosis, healthcare professionals transitioned into using the more protective N95 masks, which, as we mentioned earlier, are the ones that can protect them a lot further from the droplets. Now, there should also theoretically be an X beside each one of these check marks for tuberculosis because, while many people in Canada have been able to reap the benefits of quarantines, face masks, and medications to treat tuberculosis, it is important to remember that not all people on this land are granted these options. Tuberculosis, like many of the infectious diseases brought to Canada, has had a particularly detrimental effect on Indigenous communities. For example, and primarily still today, tuberculosis has been endemic in the north and is estimated that it actually infected a third of the entire Inuit population. Over the most plagued years, Canada forcibly picked up and separated Inuit people in the north, being in Nunavut, northern Quebec, and other communities, and brought them back to the south for treatment, separating children from families, adults from families, and placing them in institutions where they did not speak the language, they were uninformed of what was happening to them, and did not have consent of any kind. To further that, a significant amount of these Inuit were never returned back to the north. Some of them remained living in the south, completely separated from their families, while quite a large majority instead died in the south, and their graves were never notified to their families, nor have many of them been found today. The differing effects of diseases of this kind are very different when we look at racialized groups, and it's always really important to keep in mind. This is quite a long story that I can't do justice to in this time, so if anyone has interest in that, please let me know. I'll be happy to provide you with more resources. And then we have the 1918 influenza. So this one is more commonly known as the Spanish flu, not because Spain was actually the originating location of this outbreak, but because they were one of the few countries that was neutral during the war and thus able to freely report the high numbers of influenza deaths. While it is unknown exactly where the influenza originated, it is believed to have begun in the United States. In an effort to maintain a composed and strong front to enemies during the war, however, participating countries tried to play down the truly endemic effects of the flu on their soldiers. While the disease initially arrived in Canada's port cities on the eastern side of the country, it quickly spread with soldiers who carried the disease. As they traveled between home and the war fronts, the disease flourished and infections spread across both soldiers and civilian populations. When the influenza worsened in the second phase of the outbreak, different levels of Canadian governments made efforts to control the spread of the virus. As part of the effort to defend against this spread, some provinces enacted laws on quarantine and the wearing of masks. During the especially epidemic months of October and November of 1918, the province of Alberta outlawed public gatherings and ordered their citizens to wear gauze masks whenever they left their homes. Some workers, including healthcare providers, transit workers, and people required to generally keep working with the public, were required to wear gauze masks. However, there was no common understanding of mask protocols and enforcement of wearing the mask. In Ontario, citizens were never required to wear masks in public, unlike Alberta and some of the American states, despite the fact that it was equally as bad here. Toronto's medical officer of health, Dr. Charles Hastings, did not feel that there was enough evidence to warrant the use of the mask. Rather, he did not believe there was enough evidence, though there was plenty. Furthermore, in the few places where people were asked to wear masks in public, they often took them off once they were inside and socializing, which we all know kind of completely removes the purpose of having a mask. And in addition to these varying mask protocols to control the outbreak, there were many attempts across the provinces and municipalities of Canada to quarantine the infected. In Halifax, the nearby Lawler Island had historically been used to quarantine those with scarlet fever, yellow fever, smallpox, cholera, diphtheria, and tuberculosis. It was once again used during the 19 influenza epidemic as an attempt to quarantine the ill, but due to how difficult it was to diagnose the flu before it spread, it was not very successful. A few other types of small quarantine centers were used, but primarily quarantine efforts were focused on isolating the sick individuals within their own homes. In some municipalities, people with the influenza had placards pasted on the front of their homes to warn any visitors to stay away. There were also other approaches to notify people of the quarantines in their homes. In some areas of the United States, it was a popular idea to hang a white scarf, handkerchief, or piece of fabric on the front door handle to warn neighbors of the presence of the virus. And despite the efforts made to combat the 1918 influenza epidemic, approximately 55,000 Canadians died as a result of the disease. The quarantine and face mask regulations were implemented both too late and improperly. In the few places where people were asked to wear masks in public, they often took them off once inside and socializing. One upside from this, however, was that the very poor response by the government resulted in the production of a 1919 Federal Department of Health, which we now know today to be in charge of matters related to the preservation and modernization of the healthcare system and the general promotion of health of all Canadians. And now we have the 2003 SARS crisis, which is one a lot of us are more familiar with. When one Toronto woman returned from a trip to Hong Kong with the disease in the beginning of March 2003, Toronto actually became the epicenter of this outbreak in North America. While the healthcare system was better prepared and had researched, a bit of the background of this disease compared to almost 100 years prior with the 1918 influenza, the healthcare system was not quite prepared. Toronto Public Health did not have any kind of contact tracing set up to notify individuals of the need to quarantine or to trace those who were infected and their contacts. They struggled because they didn't have any kind of current disease reporting system that could be used with technology like the internet. Gradually, though, and with much struggle, they identified over 23,000 people as contacts and over 13,000 people spent 10 days isolated in their homes. Those in quarantine received phone calls from Toronto Public Health staff twice a day to see if they had any symptoms and to find out if they needed emergency food supplies. In further effort to quarantine the illness, several emergency rooms were also closed and many elective hospital treatments were postponed. With the outbreaks primarily emerging from hospitals, the province issued directives to increase the infection control precautions, including extraneous cleaning and mandatory masks for healthcare workers. Healthcare workers that were working close with the infected people were also instructed to avoid public places outside of work, avoid close contact with friends and family, and wear a mask wherever public contact was unavoidable. The Ontario government worked diligently with the City of Toronto to implement strict regulations and mitigate any further spread of the disease outside of the city. A primary lesson learned from Canada's disease management of SARS was with regards to the importance of confidentiality and patient information. While past epidemics often used signs on houses to warn of the presence of the disease, which was a practice that kind of outed patients and opened them up to hate from their communities, SARS didn't exactly manage it a whole lot better. In absence of a proper contact tracing system, Infected SARS patients were often publicly identified with their full names for all people to see and know. Throughout the SARS outbreak, the virus was commonly referred to as the Chinese disease, and this often resulted in the racial profiling of Asian Canadian communities in the media, boycotts of Asian-owned businesses, and an overall racist reaction. Now, looking at that, wouldn't it be interesting to see if Canada would reflect upon that issue and be better prepared should a situation like similar to that happen in the future? But we have COVID-19. This disease is not one that really requires too much discussion here, as let's face it, we are all living it every day. However, we're just going to go over my little checklist here. We have all of the PPE being used by our healthcare professionals, barring any shortages in the past and possible future. But I've also included an X beside the mask component. It's important to remember that we had a lot of hesitancy with people adopting mask wearing in the public up until a few months ago. While masking policies do vary across the country, provinces like PEI and Newfoundland, for example, do not have any community spread of COVID-19 due to strict travel regulations, and therefore do not regulate mask wearing in their provinces. Ontario doesn't quite have that luxury, and instead of acting quickly and getting on board with mask wearing, we waited several months into the epidemic, into the summer of 2020, before adding mask wearing to our toolkit to protect against the disease. And while hand washing is still certainly heavily weighted strategy to prevent the spread of this disease, we've also made some interesting advancements with quarantines and the like practices of social distancing. When used properly, quarantining and social distancing are detrimental to preventing the spread of this disease. We were all visiting everyone like normal, evidence from the early days in March, and perhaps as we are currently experiencing this fall, show just how dangerous it can be, as many people are now back in close-quartered, unsafe work and education environments. Ignoring these regulations can really be problematic. So when I completed this paper, it was at the beginning of September, and a bit of a different time in the COVID-19 pandemic than we are currently experiencing. My final conclusion was that we should try as best as we can to follow the lessons that we've learned from these protective equipments and strategies so we can mediate an exceptionally disastrous second wave of disease this fall. Seeing as we are equipped with all of this information on how to avoid that, theoretically, we should be able to avoid it. And well, it's a little too late for that now, sadly, as we are well into the second wave, and it is doing somewhat similarly to what we saw with the Spanish flu of being a lot worse right now than it was when it first appeared. However, there's still a few lessons that we can learn and implement into our lives. Primarily to trust the science and the doctors that are working really hard to advance the knowledge of diseases like COVID-19. While sometimes scary and other times incredibly difficult to believe, we must try and move forward with the scientific advances. Remember, at one time, people once thought that masks and gloves and protective gowns in surgical rooms were crazy ideas. Others thought that washing your hands, not being in the same room as one another, and taking weird drug concoctions was a complete farce. But here we are today, knowing that these things do work. So what this research has taught me is that in the future, there will be more advances that we may not originally understand in any sort of way. Maybe today, maybe it'll be tomorrow, maybe it'll be several years from now. But what we need to keep in mind is that all of these advances will inevitably be made in the healthcare field in the future, some of which will have the ability to change the way that future diseases impact our lives. The reality is that we might be living through an epidemic like this right now, but it could be completely altered by someone's new ideas and advancements in just a few years. Supporting that will be paramount to ensuring that others will not have to live through another pandemic in the same way that we are living through this one.